What happens when a millionaire whispers in the ear of an innocent young woman, "You're mine now"? That first night changed everything, and what happened next will leave you breathless. Tell me, where are you watching from? If you want to find out how this passionate and mysterious story continues, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. You won't regret it. The scent of sea salt and pine lingered in the air as Emily Parker passed through the wrought iron gates of the estate. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the worn leather suitcase that had once belonged to her grandmother. At 23, she could never have imagined that this moment, this decision to accept this job, would change every fiber of her being. Sometimes the greatest upheavals in our lives begin with a simple step into the unknown, she thought, as she contemplated the majestic residence that stood before her. The estate revealed itself like a sleeping giant, with its white clapboard walls and slate-grey roof, reflecting the overcast autumn sky of coastal Massachusetts. Golden maple leaves formed a crackling carpet beneath her nervous feet as she advanced, hypnotized by the austere beauty of the place. Emily adjusted the rebellious strand of chestnut hair that danced before her green eyes. She had been hired as an art restorer, a rare opportunity for a young graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design, with no connections in the elitist world of auctions and private collections. All she knew about her employer amounted to a name, James Richardson, and a reputation for coldness in business and social isolation. The white gravel crunched under her steps as she approached the entrance. The golden afternoon light caressed the ancient stones, revealing centuries of New England history etched into their veins. Emily paused for a moment, breathing deeply the air laden with pine and history. Three qualities defined her deeply: an insatiable curiosity for forgotten stories, an unwavering loyalty to those she loved, and a vulnerability carefully masked by an appearance of strength. Orphaned of her mother at 15, she had forged an emotional armor that rarely allowed others to see her vulnerabilities. Her father, a literature professor at Boston University, had raised her in the love of arts, but also in a modesty that made her doubt her place in the world she dreamed of exploring. The heavy oak door opened before she even reached the portico. An elderly man with stooped shoulders and a benevolent gaze appeared, dressed in an impeccable uniform. "Miss Parker, I presume. I am William, butler to the Richardson family for 37 years. We've been expecting you." His voice had the texture of worn velvet, reassuring and authentic. He stepped aside to let her enter a vestibule of impressive proportions, where local marble conversed with century-old wood paneling. "Will Mr. Richardson be—" she began, but her question hung suspended in the fresh air of the hall. "Mr. Richardson will meet you this evening. In the meantime, allow me to show you to your quarters and the library where you'll be working." She followed William through a maze of corridors with New England hardwood floors, breathing in the effluvia of beeswax and suspended time. Each step resonated like a promise. Each turn revealed a new beauty fixed in stone and time. What she didn't know then was that the owner, James Richardson, a 42-year-old man with storm-colored eyes, was already observing her from his study window, feeling for the first time in 5 long years something awakening in his dormant heart. The twilight enveloped the estate in a purple and gold mantle as Emily organized her materials in the library. Her fingers reverently caressed the ancient bindings that lined the walls. The smell of books and linseed oil mingled in this space that seemed preserved from another century. The library was a work of art in itself, a coffered ceiling adorned with floral motifs, massive oak shelves rising to the sky, and arched windows that promised to flood the room with natural light in the morning. In a corner, near the limestone fireplace, rested the paintings she would have to restore, 17 preciously wrapped canvases awaiting her expertise. The sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor, a slow and measured rhythm that made Emily straighten. Without knowing why, she held her breath. The door opened silently. James Richardson appeared, bringing with him the aroma of American tobacco and something indefinable, perhaps loneliness. He was tall, with broad shoulders under his impeccable white shirt and charcoal vest. His black hair, streaked with gray, framed a face with features chiseled by years and experience. But it was his eyes that captivated Emily. Gray like Atlantic storms, they carried the weight of someone who has lived too much without really living. "Miss Parker," he said in a deep voice that seemed to emerge from the depths of his being. His slight New England accent softened his words. "Mr. Richardson," she replied, inclining her head slightly, suddenly aware of the simplicity of her navy blue dress against this man's natural elegance. He approached the painting she was examining, an authentic Monet representing a garden bathed in New England light. "Did you have a good journey from Boston?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the canvas. "Yes, thank you. The landscape was magnificent. New England has that effect on people. It seems ordinary at first glance, then reveals its depth to those who take the time to truly look." These words held a personal resonance that made Emily shiver. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but charged with an indefinable energy. "You're mine now," he murmured finally, his eyes meeting hers. Seeing her surprised expression, he clarified, "I mean, your time, your skills, for the next 6 months." His words didn't convey possession, they expressed relief. He explained that she was the only restorer who had accepted the challenge of recovering the collection that had belonged to his ex-wife, Elizabeth. Emily shivered, not from fear but from an inexplicable emotion upon perceiving the raw pain in his eyes. "These paintings are more than works of art to you, aren't they?" she dared to ask, surprised by her own boldness. A rictus that could have been a smile crossed his face. "Perceptive, Miss Parker. These paintings are the last witnesses to a story I failed to preserve. But I won't bore you with that tonight." He headed toward an inlaid secretary desk and pulled out a leather-bound folder. "Here's the complete inventory, with the history of each piece. I've had the blue room prepared for you. It offers the best morning light for your sketches. William mentioned you like to draw upon waking." Emily blushed slightly, surprised he had taken the time to inquire about her habits. "Thank you for the consideration, Mr. Richardson." "James," he gently corrected. "We'll be spending a lot of time under the same roof. Formalities seem excessive." When he left the room a few minutes later, Emily realized she had been holding her breath. Something about this man evoked both the strength of an impregnable fortress and the fragility of a painting cracked by time, a contradiction that awakened her curiosity and reactivated her restorer's instinct. She approached the window, observing the garden of salt spray roses bathed in the silver moonlight. Below, a solitary figure, James, walked slowly among the maple trees, his silhouette etched against the starry sky like a figure from Caspar David Friedrich, romantic and tormented. "What broke your heart to the point of transforming you into a guardian of a past you cannot release?" she thought, already sensing that this mission would far exceed the simple restoration of paintings. The weeks flowed by with the regularity of an old metronome. Each morning, Emily rose with the dawn, welcomed by the golden light filtering through the silk curtains of the blue room. Each day, she immersed herself in the world of pigments, solvents, and brushes as fine as eyelashes, working meticulously on the impressionist canvases that gradually revealed their former splendor under her expert fingers. James began to appear every afternoon at 5 o'clock, as if summoned by an invisible clock to the library. He always brought coffee served in Lenox porcelain on a silver tray, sometimes accompanied by freshly baked shortbread cookies or cranberry scones, still warm from the oven. These visits became an anticipated ritual, a parenthesis in time when the estate seemed to breathe differently. James would settle into the leather armchair by the window, watching Emily work, and gradually he began to talk. "This Renoir you're restoring," he said one day, "was the first painting Elizabeth and I bought together. We found it in a small gallery in Newport, on a day when the nor'easter wind was so strong it seemed it would carry away the rooftops." He would tell stories about each painting, and Emily noticed how his voice softened when speaking of the wife who had left him 5 years earlier, departed for San Francisco without explanations, leaving only a cold letter and the art collection she had so loved. One particularly warm October afternoon, while Emily worked on a delicate Sisley depicting a bridge over the Charles River, James remained silent longer than usual. "Why restore these paintings now?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. "After 5 years?" James slowly turned his cup between his long fingers, contemplating the amber liquid as if seeking answers within it. "Because I'm beginning to forget her face," he finally confessed, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "I wake sometimes no longer remembering the exact curve of her smile, the precise shade of her eyes. These paintings are the only things that still bear the imprint of our moments together." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Emily felt a strange pain in her chest. Was it compassion or something more complex? She didn't dare analyze it. Art preserves what memory cannot retain, she said softly. That's why we restore, not to erase time but to honor what deserves to persist. Their eyes met, and for the first time Emily saw a glimmer of appreciation in James's grey gaze, not for her technical talent, but for her understanding. That evening, she made a discovery that upset the fragile equilibrium they had established. While carefully removing the frame from a 19th-century landscape to treat discoloration, another painting fell from the back, where it had been hidden, an unfinished portrait. It was Elizabeth, painted with evident tenderness, a slender woman with chestnut hair, high cheekbones, and eyes of such an intense blue they almost appeared violet in certain lights. When James entered at 5 o'clock the next day, the portrait was placed on an easel near the window. He stopped short, the tray wavering dangerously in his hands. "How—" he began, unable to finish his sentence. "It was hidden behind the corot," Emily gently explained. "I didn't mean to be intrusive, but it needed air. The canvas was beginning to mold." James slowly set down the tray and approached the portrait, like one approaches an injured animal, with caution and reverence. "I painted it myself," he confessed, his hand hovering above the canvas without touching it. "During a summer in Newport, months before she left. I never had the courage to finish it after she departed." For the first time, Emily saw him truly vulnerable, no longer the distant estate owner, but a man confronted with the tangible remnants of his grief. "You have a gift," she said sincerely, "the way you captured the light in her eyes." "I was an architect before taking over the family business," he replied with a shrug that attempted to minimize his talent. "Drawing was my first passion." A bold idea germinated in Emily's mind. What if we finished it together?" she proposed. "I could show you some techniques, and you could, perhaps, find a form of closure." James looked at her for a long time, his face unreadable. Then, against all expectations, a slight smile softened his features. "You're dangerous, Miss Parker," he said, in a voice that mixed amusement and melancholy. "You make me want to believe that certain wounds can heal." That night from her room, Emily heard for the first time a melody on the piano rising from the west wing of the estate, the melancholy notes of Chopin dancing in the darkness, as if the house itself was beginning to awaken from a long sleep. The estate had found its rhythm, mornings devoted to methodical restoration, afternoons punctuated by the ritual of coffee and increasingly personal conversations, and now evenings when James and Emily worked together on Elizabeth's portrait. These moments of shared creation had established between them a new complicity, fragile as a silk thread, but just as resilient. November arrived with its morning mists and changing skies. On a particularly cold morning, as Emily studied a crack in a dagger, the sound of a luxury automobile on the entrance gravel broke the quietude of the estate. Voices rose in the hall, a woman speaking English with a pronounced Manhattan accent, and William responding with a deference tinged with reluctance. The library door opened abruptly to reveal a woman in her 40s, tall and thin, dressed in a Ralph Lauren black suit and pearls that seemed to capture all the light in the room. Her elegance was as intimidating as the scrutinizing gaze she placed on Emily. "Ah, here's the famous restorer," she said, each syllable chiseled by years of education in the finest American institutions. "I'm Charlotte Richardson Wells, James's sister." Emily rose, aware of her blouse stained with pigments and her hair tied negligently. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Wells. Emily Parker." Yes. William tells me you've been living here for... how long?" 2 months?" Charlotte surveyed the room, noting the signs of Emily's prolonged presence. Sketches pinned to the wall, the shawl thrown over the back of the armchair, art books opened on various surfaces. "I'm housed here to facilitate my work on the collection," Emily explained, feeling the need to justify herself despite herself. Charlotte approached the easel where Elizabeth's portrait rested, now half finished. Her perfectly drawn eyebrows arched slightly. "Interesting. I didn't know restoration involved completing James's works." There was in her voice an insinuation that brought color to Emily's cheeks. Before she could respond, James appeared at the door, his expression shifting from surprise to controlled irritation upon seeing his sister. "Charlotte, what an unexpected visit." "Unexpected? I called yesterday." "Didn't your butler relay the message?" she replied, kissing her brother on both cheeks with an affection that seemed more protocol than sincere. James's gaze briefly rested on Emily, as if silently apologizing. "We can talk in my study." "Certainly, but I thought we might have lunch together, all three of us," Charlotte insisted with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I wish to become better acquainted with Miss Parker." Lunch was served on the terrace overlooking vineyards and maples. Despite the grey sky, the view was breathtaking. Orderly rows of grapevines descending toward the valley, framed by the violet silhouettes of the distant Massachusetts hills. William had prepared an elegant meal: butternut squash soup, grilled sea bass with local herbs, and lemon meringue pie. The conversation remained superficial: art, weather, Boston, until Emily was sent to fetch a book from the library. Returning, she heard her name spoken by Charlotte, in a sentence laden with condescension. "This Emily, though charming, remains a young woman from the streets of Boston. My brother is vulnerable, my dear. Don't delude yourself about your place here." Emily froze in the corridor, her heart beating painfully against her ribs. She was about to turn back when James's response stopped her in her tracks. "She's the first person in 5 years to see beyond the landed gentleman or the pathetic widower," he said in a voice so low that Emily had to strain to hear. "She sees the man I was before I lost myself. Don't underestimate her because her name doesn't appear in the social register, Charlotte." Emily deliberately made noise as she resumed walking, entering the terrace as if she had heard nothing. But as she set the book between them, her eyes met James's, and a silent understanding passed between them. That evening, after Charlotte's departure, Emily found James in the garden, watching the stars beginning to appear in the sky, cleared by the northeasterly wind. "I owe you an apology for my sister," he said without preamble. "She believes she's protecting me." "From what exactly?" asked Emily, wrapping herself more tightly in her shawl. James remained silent a moment, then turned to her. The twilight light softened his features, revealing the younger man he had once been. "From change, I suppose. From anything that might upset the precarious equilibrium I've established." He hesitated. "From you, perhaps." Emily felt her heart accelerate but maintained a calm expression. "I'm just a restorer, James. I repair what's broken. I don't break what's intact." A fleeting smile crossed his face. "Are you sure about that, Emily Parker? Because since your arrival, walls I thought unshakable have begun to show cracks." There was no accusation in his voice, rather a sort of uneasy wonder. Before she could respond, he added, "But perhaps some structures need to be shaken to be rebuilt stronger." That night, looking from her window at the estate lights reflected in the garden fountain, Emily felt for the first time the weight of social difference as a tangible abyss. She was tempted to call her father in Boston, ready to abandon this mission that was becoming dangerously personal. But on her desk, Elizabeth's portrait looked at her with its half-finished eyes, a silent reminder that there was something unfinished here that deserved completion, whatever the cost. December transformed the estate into a living painting. The white stones sprinkled with frost in the morning, fires crackling in the fireplaces, discreet garlands that William had arranged with an elegance that respected the silent mourning of the place. Emily had completed the restoration of 7 paintings, each now hanging in different rooms of the estate, progressively bringing life back to spaces long abandoned to silence. Elizabeth's portrait was advancing slowly. James now worked on it alone some evenings, as if this process had become a form of private dialogue with the past. Emily respected this newfound intimacy, understanding that certain healings require solitude. One afternoon, as icy rain beat against the windows, Emily was searching for a work on gilding restoration techniques in the library. While leafing through an ancient copy of The Scarlet Letter by Hawthorne, something slipped from between the pages, a yellowed letter, written in a fine and elegant hand. The letter was addressed to "My dear Henry" and signed, "Your devoted Margaret." The paper had the soft texture that only time can confer. Emily was about to replace it in the book when the recipient's surname caught her attention. Henry Richardson. Heart pounding, she examined the date, 1938. The sender was Margaret Parker. With trembling hands she read the letter, a correspondence between her grandmother and James's grandfather, evoking their friendship in Boston before the war separated them. The tone was one of deep but respectful affection, speaking of walks along the Charles River and discussions about art and literature. "My dear Henry, may you find in your new home in New England the peace that Boston can no longer offer you. I shall keep our conversations as treasures in the dark days ahead. The letter concluded with a promise to meet again when the clouds have left our sky. A promise never kept, realized Emily, as she thought of the family history her father had told her, where her grandmother had to flee westward during the war. When James entered for their 5 o'clock ritual, he found Emily sitting motionless, the letter placed before her, her eyes bright with contained emotions. "Emily? What's happening?" he asked, alarmed by her expression. Silently, she handed him the letter. He read it slowly, his face moving from curiosity to astonishment. "Margaret Parker, your grandmother," he murmured finally. Emily nodded. "And Henry was my grandfather, yes." James sat heavily, contemplating the yellowed paper with reverence. He sometimes spoke of a friend from Boston, a brilliant woman who understood art like no one else. He said she disappeared during the war. He tried to find her afterward, but without success. An invisible thread connecting their family histories now floated between them, bringing a sense of destiny that neither could ignore. "It seems our families were destined to cross paths," Emily said softly. James looked at her for a long time, a new understanding in his eyes. Perhaps certain connections are too strong to be erased, even by time or circumstances. This discovery changed something fundamental in their relationship. The distance imposed by their social differences seemed to diminish, replaced by a sense of shared heritage, as if their paths had always been destined to converge in this New England estate. The next day, James took her to a part of the estate she had never visited, the East Wing, closed for years. Equipped with flashlights, they explored rooms where white sheets covered the furniture like silent ghosts. "I thought to renovate it one day," explained James, his voice resonating in the empty spaces. "To make it a gallery, perhaps. But after Elizabeth left, I couldn't find the motivation." Emily approached a window and cleaned the dust from the glass, revealing a spectacular view of the maple forests that extended to the horizon. The winter light transformed the landscape into a watercolor of blues and grays. "It would be magnificent," she said sincerely, "a space where art could dialogue with this landscape." James approached, looking over her shoulder. His proximity was both comforting and disturbing. "What if we did it?" he proposed suddenly. "If we gave this space a new purpose?" Emily turned to face him, surprised by the new enthusiasm in his voice. "What do you mean?" "I don't know exactly yet," he admitted. "But for the first time in 5 years, I want to build something, not just preserve ruins." This conversation marked a decisive turning point. James began making plans, contacting architects, imagining a new life for this abandoned wing of the estate. Emily watched him come alive in this creative process, as if the letter had unlocked a door long closed in his heart. But amid this renaissance, a new obstacle loomed on the horizon. One evening, bringing documents to James in his study, Emily heard a telephone conversation that stopped her in her tracks. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell. No, I understand the implications. Yes, she's still at the estate. No, I haven't yet signed the divorce papers." Emily's heart stopped. Elizabeth wasn't his ex-wife, only his separated wife. This revelation instantly transformed the dynamics of their nascent relationship, brutally reminding Emily that James's past wasn't simply a memory to restore, but a legal reality still present. She silently deposited the documents on a console in the corridor and withdrew to her room, her heart heavy with unanswered questions and feelings she didn't yet dare to name. January brought with it a biting cold that insinuated itself into the ancient stones of the estate, defying even the generous fires that burned in the fireplaces. Emily was now working on one of the most precious pieces in the collection, a Renoir depicting a pensive young woman on a New England terrace, with colors so vibrant they seemed to capture light itself. Since her discovery regarding James's marital status, a subtle distance had installed itself between them. Their conversations remained cordial but more reserved, as if an invisible boundary had been drawn. James seemed to sense this withdrawal but didn't question it, respecting the new emotional perimeter she had established. On a frigid morning, as Emily meticulously examined the Renoir under her special magnifying glass, she noticed something that froze her professional blood, tiny bubbles forming under the paint surface, a sign of deterioration that was rapidly progressing. Excessive humidity, perhaps due to temperature fluctuations in the ancient estate, threatened to irreparably destroy the work. "William," she called, the urgency in her voice making the butler come running. "I need emergency heaters, dehumidifiers, and contact Mr. James immediately." The hours that followed were a race against time. Emily improvised a crisis workshop in the library, transforming the large table into an emergency laboratory. When James arrived, having rushed back from a meeting in Providence, he found Emily absorbed in a delicate operation, her sure hands working with absolute concentration. "What's happening?" he asked, alarmed by the emergency setup. "Accelerated deterioration," she replied without raising her eyes from the canvas. "Humidity has penetrated beneath the paint layer. If we don't intervene immediately, the pigments will detach from the support." James approached, his face reflecting a sincere concern, not for the financial value of the work, Emily realized, but for what it represented emotionally. "What can I do?" he asked simply. "Hold this lamp exactly at this angle," she indicated, grateful for this offer of practical help rather than questions or reproaches. They worked side by side for hours, James following each instruction with a precision that revealed his past as an architect. William brought hot chocolate and cookies that exhaled an aroma of cinnamon, but they grew cold, forgotten in the intensity of the moment. Night had long fallen when Emily finally straightened, her back protesting after 17 hours bent over the canvas. Her eyes burned with fatigue, and her hands were stained with pigments and special oils. "It's stabilized," she announced, her voice hoarse from having spoken and drunk too little. "We've arrested the degradation process. Tomorrow I can begin the real restoration." James gently set down the lamp and massaged his shoulders. His normally impeccable hair was disheveled, and his white shirt bore traces of blue pigments. "You're extraordinary," he said simply, his gaze expressing an admiration that far exceeded the professional framework. Emily tried to stand, but her numbed legs gave way beneath her. James caught her instinctively, his strong arms stabilizing her against him. The unexpected contact created a moment of shared vulnerability. They were suddenly very close, their faces just inches apart, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. "Your hair," she murmured with a small nervous laugh trying to dissipate the tension, "looks like a nest of New England seagulls." James looked at her, surprised, then burst into spontaneous laughter that illuminated his face in a way she had never seen before. It was a rusty sound, like a long-closed door finally opening. The first real laugh he had expressed in 5 years, she realized. This moment of shared lightness in stress and exhaustion created between them a new intimacy, different from that which had developed through their conversations about art and the past. It was a connection forged in common action, in mutual professional trust in the vulnerability of shared effort, Ed. Later that night, after William had insisted they eat something, they found themselves sitting on the carpet before the library fireplace, sharing a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet and silently contemplating the saved Renoir, now secured in a controlled environment. "Why didn't you tell me that Elizabeth is still legally your wife?" Emily suddenly asked, the words escaping before she could hold them back. James froze, his glass halfway to his lips. His eyes sought hers in the dancing firelight. "You heard my conversation with the lawyer," he stated without anger, just a resignation tinged with regret. "I didn't mention it because, in my mind, in my heart, this marriage ended long ago. The papers are just a formality that I postponed because it required a form of closure I wasn't ready to face." He set down his glass and turned completely toward her. "But you're right to ask the question. I should have been more transparent." This moment of raw honesty created a new space between them, a space where difficult truths could exist without judgment, where the complexity of their respective situations was recognized rather than simplified. "I'm beginning to understand," Emily said softly, "that restoration isn't just a matter of technique or knowledge. It's also knowing when to intervene and when to let time do its work." James looked at her for a long time, as if seeing beyond the fatigue and paint stains to the very essence of who she was. "In that case," he finally replied, "I believe I myself am in the process of being restored, Miss Parker. And for the first time, I'm not certain I want the process to conclude too quickly." The February sky alternated between icy showers and luminous clearings that transformed the New England landscape into an impressionist canvas of changing lights. Emily had now restored 11 paintings, each coming back to life under her patient fingers, regaining the vibrance and depth that time had veiled. A comfortable routine had established itself between her and James, a delicate equilibrium made of professional respect and a growing intimacy that nonetheless remained within the bounds of propriety. They now shared their evening meals in the small dining room, discussing art, literature, and sometimes, with caution, their respective pasts. One afternoon, as Emily worked on a Cézanne still life, voices rose from the terrace. James and an older man, their animated conversation carried by the north wind to the half-open library window. "She explicitly asked that you read this letter only when you were ready to move forward, James," the man was saying with the authority of someone accustomed to handling important documents. "And from what William has told me, that moment may have arrived." Emily didn't want to listen, but James's next words stopped her in place. 5 years, Mr. Blackwell. 5 years during which I respected her request not to look for her, not to interfere with her new life. And now you're telling me she left another letter. A sealed letter, with very precise instructions. She made me promise to deliver it to you, only if you ever found again. How did she phrase it? Ah, yes. The joy of living. A silence settled. Then James resumed, his voice lower but still audible. "And what makes you think that moment has arrived? My dear friend, I've been coming here every 3 months for 5 years. This is the first time I've heard music in this house, seen paintings hanging rather than packed away, and heard William speak of renovation projects for the East Wing. Something has changed." Emily moved away from the window, her heart pounding, aware of having overheard a private conversation. But the implications of these words resonated within her. Had she really been the instrument of such a change in James's life? That evening he didn't come for their usual dinner. William informed Emily that the master was dining in his private apartments and apologized for his absence. She ate alone, her mind circling around the mysterious letter and what it might contain. The next morning James appeared in the library, his features drawn as if after a sleepless night. Without preamble, he handed her a sheet of paper. "I think you should read this," he said simply. The letter was written in an elegant and assured hand, that of Elizabeth Richardson, dated 5 years ago, a few days before her departure for San Francisco. "My dear James, if you are reading these words, it means something or someone has finally managed to pierce the fortress you built around your heart after my departure. I am deeply relieved. Our marriage did not fail for lack of love or respect, but because we loved different versions of each other. You, the passionate young woman I was in Boston. I, the brilliant architect you were before sacrificing your dreams for the family business. Don't make our memories a sanctuary. They deserve better than to become relics under glass. Here's what I wish for you, that you dance again to the sound of jazz under the New England stars, that you travel to the Pacific Northwest as we had planned, that you plant those English roses I love so much in the East Garden, and above all that you open your heart to the possibility of new love, without guilt or comparison. I sign these divorce papers not as an end, but as a liberation for us both, with affection and gratitude for what we shared. Elizabeth." Emily raised her eyes, moved to tears by the generosity of this woman she had never met, but whose presence had defined the contours of her life at the estate. "We became guardians of our respective pasts, unable to evolve together. I ask you now that you're beginning to rediscover a taste for life, not to cling to the past I destroyed." "She seems extraordinary," she said softly. James nodded, his expression indecipherable. "She is. That's why I loved her so much, and why I was unable to hate her despite the pain of her departure." He turned away, looking out the window toward the hills that were beginning to be covered with early precocious flowers. "I signed the divorce papers last night after 5 years of hesitation," he said finally. "They left this morning by express courier for San Francisco." Emily felt the weight of this confidence, how much this gesture represented a definitive break with the past he had so long preserved. "What finally decided you?" she dared to ask. James turned toward her, and in his grey eyes shone a new clarity, like a sky after the storm. "You," he said simply. "Your presence here reminded me that life is movement, not preservation. That art itself exists only because it evolves, is interpreted, is renewed in the eye of each observer." He took a step toward her, then stopped, still respecting the space between them. "I'm not asking anything of you, Emily. I just wanted you to understand why these last months have been transformative for me. and why I'll be eternally grateful to you, whatever direction your life takes after your mission here." These words, pronounced with a new vulnerability and a rediscovered strength, marked a turning point. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet, but it was the recognition that a chapter was closing, perhaps allowing another to begin. The next day, Emily found a catalogue of nurseries specializing in English roses on her desk, with a simple note: "For the East Garden, your expertise would be valuable." This invitation to participate in the realization of one of Elizabeth's wishes was more eloquent than any declaration. It was James asking her to be part of his future, not just to restore his past. March arrived with the promise of spring, bringing longer days and a cerulean blue sky that made the stones of the estate almost incandescent under the New England sun. The restoration work was drawing to a close. Only 3 canvases still awaited Emily's care, including a particularly delicate one representing Giverny Gardens by Monet. One morning, as the estate gently awakened, William brought Emily an envelope bearing the emblem of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. She had applied for a position as assistant restorer at the prestigious New York Museum almost a year earlier, well before her arrival at the Richardson estate. The letter, signed by the director of the restoration department himself, was a formal offer for a coveted position, a professional recognition she had always dreamed of. The position would begin in 3 weeks, well before the planned end of her contract with James. Emily remained motionless on the sunny terrace, the letter in her hands, her mind in turmoil. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, the kind of professional recognition that would open all doors in her field. But accepting meant leaving the estate, leaving James, well before the agreed-upon term, leaving this place that had become unexpectedly a home. All day she worked mechanically on the Monet, her mind elsewhere, torn between professional ambition and emotional attachment. At 23, did she have the right to prioritize nascent feelings at the expense of her career? Or should she seize this unique opportunity, even at the risk of losing what was developing between James and her? At dinner, she showed him the letter, unable to keep this secret despite her inner confusion. James read it carefully, his expression moving from surprise to pride, then to a veiled resignation he tried to mask. "It's an exceptional recognition," he finally said, returning the letter with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You amply deserve it." "I haven't accepted yet," replied Emily, scrutinizing his face for a reaction. "My contract here isn't finished, and the final restorations are crucial." James delicately set down his wineglass and looked at her directly. "Emily," he said softly, using her first name with an intimacy that made her shiver, "I will never be the one who asks you to sacrifice your professional future. You're too talented for your gifts to remain confined to a private estate, however beautiful it may be." The nobility of his reaction intensified her inner dilemma. She would have almost preferred that he ask her to stay, that he openly express his desire to keep her near him. "And if I wish to stay?" she asked, her voice barely louder than a whisper. James looked at her for a long time, as if trying to memorize every detail of her face. "Then I would tell you that the estate and its paintings will always be here, but that an opportunity like the Metropolitan Museum might not present itself again." He hesitated, then added, "And I would also tell you that certain feelings, if they are true, survive distance and time." This response, generous but ambiguous, resolved nothing. Emily spent a restless night, sleep eluding her as she weighed her options, alternately imagining her life in New York, surrounded by world masterpieces, and here, in this estate where she had found much more than a simple job. In the morning, exhausted but resolute, she found James in the East Garden, where the first roses they had planted together were just beginning to bud. He was studying plans for the renovation of the East Wing, the morning sun illuminating his profile. "I've made my decision," she announced without preamble. He straightened, his expression carefully neutral. "And what is it?" "I'll accept the Met," she began, noting how his shoulders imperceptibly slumped. "But not now. I wrote to them this morning to request a 6-month postponement. Time to properly complete my commitment here, and to clarify certain things." The hope that crossed James's face was fleeting but undeniable. 6 months, he repeated, as if to savor these words. "It's a wise solution, professionally responsible." Emily approached, reducing the distance between them with new courage. "It's not just a professional decision, James," she said softly. "I'm not ready to leave this estate. Not yet." They looked at each other, the unspoken floating between them like cherry blossoms that the spring wind tore from nearby trees. "And after these 6 months?" he dared to ask. "After? We'll see if what we feel is strong enough to survive the distance between New York and New England. I need this certainty before—" She didn't finish her sentence, but her gaze said everything words couldn't express. James nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom of this approach. At 42, with a broken marriage behind him, he respected her need for caution, her desire not to sacrifice her independence for emotions that might prove ephemeral. 6 months, he repeated, this time with a smile that reached his eyes. Just enough time for these roses to bloom fully. The metaphor wasn't lost on Emily. Some things couldn't be rushed, neither roses nor art restoration, nor the blossoming of deep and lasting feelings. This decision, this compromise between reason and emotion, created between them a new space, a possible future they could build together, stone by stone, as the estate itself had been erected through the centuries to endure. April unfurled over New England a spectacle of colors, fields of scarlet azaleas contrasting with the tender green of new vines, early cherry blossoms timidly pointing their stems toward a capricious sky. But the beauty of the New England spring also carried its dangers. The north wind blew with rare intensity, and violent storms accumulated on the foothills of the Berkshires. Emily had completed the restoration of 14 paintings, leaving only the most precious, a self-portrait by Berthe Morisot of inestimable value, both financially and sentimentally. It was Elizabeth's favorite painting, the one she contemplated each morning while taking coffee on the East Terrace. That evening, James had left for Newport, where he was to meet an architect specializing in the restoration of historic buildings to discuss plans for the East Wing. Emily dined alone in the small dining room, listening to the wind that howled around the estate, making the century-old shutters groan. William entered, his usually impassive face betraying an unusual concern. "Miss, the forecast announces a violent storm tonight. We've secured the exteriors, but some parts of the East Wing's roof are fragile. Mr. Richardson has called to say he won't be able to return tonight. The roads are already flooded toward Portsmouth." Emily nodded, a hint of concern arising in her. "Thank you, William. Is there anything I can do?" The butler hesitated. "Perhaps verify that the artworks in the library are well protected. I'll ensure all windows are closed." He had barely left the room when lightning rent the sky, immediately followed by a deafening thunderclap that made the glasses on the table tremble. The lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the estate into almost total darkness. Emily made her way by feel toward the kitchen, where she found William already busy lighting antique lanterns. "The emergency generators should activate within a few minutes," he explained, handing her a copper lantern. "But these Berkshire storms can last all night." Armed with her lantern, Emily headed toward the library. The flickering light created dancing shadows on the walls, giving life to the motifs of ancient tapestries in an almost unsettling way. The library, normally so welcoming, now seemed mysterious and slightly threatening in this moving penumbra. She had just finished covering the paintings with protective covers when the sound of breaking glass resonated somewhere in the East Wing. Then a cry from William, not of pain but of alarm. "Fire! Fire in the East Wing! The lightning must have struck the tower!" Emily's heart stopped. The East Wing, where not only antique furniture was stored, but also the already restored paintings, including Elizabeth's portrait that James had finally completed with such emotion. Without thinking, she dashed toward the spiral staircase that led to the condemned wing. Smoke was already infiltrating under the sealed door that separated the two parts of the estate. William appeared behind her, trying to restrain her. "Miss, it's too dangerous. I've called the fire department. They'll be here in 20 minutes. But Emily couldn't wait. "The paintings, William." "The entire restored collection is there." Before he could protest further, she had unlocked the heavy door and slipped into the smoky corridor. The heat hit her like a wall, and the acrid smoke burned her eyes, but she continued to advance, guided by the faint light of her lantern and her knowledge of the place. The main gallery, where the paintings had been temporarily hung, was still spared from the flames that were devouring the roof of the adjacent tower. Emily rushed to the wall where Elizabeth's portrait hung, taking it down with care despite the urgency. One by one she began gathering the most precious paintings, carefully stacking them near the door. William, despite his 70 years, joined her, his loyalty to the estate and its master prevailing over prudence. Together they formed a chain, transporting the artworks toward the relative safety of the main wing. They had just saved the last Degas when an ominous cracking sounded above them. Emily looked up to see a massive oak beam, blackened by fire, beginning to give way. "William, out!" she shouted, pushing the butler toward the door. He stumbled forward, clutching the small painting to himself at the moment when the beam began its fatal descent. Emily knew she wouldn't have time to reach the door. In a desperate reflex, she threw herself under a massive oak table, curling up as the beam crashed to the floor in a shower of sparks and debris. The smoke was now so dense she could barely breathe. The heat was becoming unbearable, and Emily's consciousness was beginning to fade when she heard a voice, impossible but undeniable, that of James, calling her name with palpable terror. A figure materialized through the curtain of smoke. James, his face blackened, his clothes soaked from the torrential rain that was now falling through the collapsed roof. "Emily!" he shouted, searching frantically in the smoke-filled room. "Here," she managed to articulate, her voice barely audible. He found her, half-conscious under the table, and without hesitation lifted her into his arms. At the same moment, a new section of the roof gave way, sending a cascade of rainwater and flaming debris into the room. With a strength born of desperation, James protected Emily with his own body, holding her against him as he made his way toward the exit, each step an act of will against the heat and exhaustion. They finally emerged into the main courtyard, where the first lights of the fire trucks appeared at the end of the Cypress Avenue. The rain fell in torrents, washing the soot from their faces as they collapsed onto the ancient cobblestones, panting and covered in ash, but alive. James still held Emily against him, as if afraid she would disappear if he let her go. His body trembled, not from cold despite the icy rain, but from a raw and primordial emotion. "Why?" he murmured, his voice broken by smoke and emotion. "Why did you risk your life for paintings?" Emily raised her eyes to him, seeing in his gaze a terror that had nothing to do with the fire now raging behind them. "Because they're important to you," she replied simply. "Because they're your history." James closed his eyes, holding Emily even more tightly. When he reopened them, they shone with an emotion that transcended fear and relief. "The paintings can burn," he said, each word laden with a fundamental truth he had just realized. "Memories can fade, but you have become irreplaceable, Emily Parker." Under the beating rain, with the estate in flames behind them and the fire truck's sirens in the background, something fundamental had changed. James had finally understood that preserving the past made sense only if there was a future to build. "How did you get back?" asked Emily, suddenly realizing the impossibility of his presence. "The roads were cut off. I abandoned the car 10 miles from here and continued on foot," he replied simply. "William called me. When he said you had entered the burning wing..." He didn't finish his sentence, but his gaze said everything. The absolute terror he had felt, the sudden certainty that nothing else mattered if she was no longer there to share it. The firefighters took over, progressively mastering the fire which, miraculously, had destroyed only part of the east wing. Wrapped in thermal blankets, Emily and James watched the flames recede under the assault of fire hoses, their hands intertwined in a gesture that seemed as natural as breathing. "I was afraid of losing the paintings," admitted Emily, her voice still hoarse from smoke. "But I realized something tonight. They're just objects, precious, irreplaceable even, but not alive," completed James, his eyes never leaving her face. "Not like you. In this night of destruction, something new had been created, a certainty that didn't exist before, a commitment that transcended the doubts and hesitations of recent months. The fire had burned more than ancient beams. It had consumed the last barriers between them. The days following the fire were a whirlwind of activity. Insurance experts, workers, architects, and emergency restorers succeeded each other at the estate, assessing the damage and securing the structure. Miraculously, thanks to Emily and William's quick intervention, most of the paintings had been saved, though some had suffered minor damage from smoke and water. James had taken charge with new energy, coordinating the reconstruction efforts, making quick but thoughtful decisions, as if the fire had awakened long-dormant capabilities in him. But each evening, exhausted, he rejoined Emily in the library, which had become their common refuge, and there he dropped the mask of the efficient estate owner to become simply a man confronting his emotions. A week after the fire, as the April sky adorned itself with a spectacular sunset, Emily found James on the west terrace, contemplating the scaffolding that now surrounded the damaged wing. "The architects say the main structure is intact," he said without turning, sensing her presence. "We'll be able to rebuild. Better even." Emily approached, leaning on the balustrade beside him. The air still smelled slightly of smoke, but also of jasmine that was beginning to bloom along the walls. "It's strange," she said softly, "how destruction can sometimes be a new beginning." James turned his face toward her, studying her profile in the golden evening light. The small scratches on her cheek, vestiges of their flight through the flaming debris, were beginning to fade. "I have something to show you," he said, with an unusual nervousness in his voice, "if you feel strong enough for a short walk." They descended together toward the vineyard, following a path bordered by maples that Emily had never taken before. After about 10 minutes, they arrived at a small clearing surrounded by century-old oaks. At the center stood a simple but elegant structure, a pavilion in white stone with columns reminiscent of Greek temples, visibly ancient but well preserved. "This was my grandfather's meditation pavilion," explained James. "I hadn't returned here since Elizabeth left." He produced an ancient key and opened the carved wooden door. The interior was a circular room, bathed in the sunset light through strategically oriented windows. Shelves covered with books and sketchbooks surrounded a central walnut desk. "This is where I came to draw, before taking over the family business," said James, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "This is where I conceived my first architectural projects." Emily toured the room, reverently touching objects that told the story of a James she had never known. The young man passionate about art and architecture before family responsibilities and expectations reshaped his life. "Why show me this place now?" she asked softly. James approached the desk and pulled out a folder which he handed to her. "Because I've made a decision, and you deserve to fully understand it." Emily opened the folder to discover medical documents, examination results, prescriptions, doctor's letters. They concerned James and mentioned a familial hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, an inherited heart condition. "You're ill?" she asked, a sudden fear clutching her throat. "Not seriously," he immediately reassured her. "It's a condition I share with several members of the Richardson family. It requires regular monitoring and certain precautions, but with modern treatments, it doesn't significantly affect life expectancy." "Why did you never tell me?" James sat on the edge of the desk, his eyes seeking hers with a new vulnerability. "Because it was this condition that precipitated Elizabeth's departure," he finally admitted. "Not directly. She wasn't that cruel. But the diagnosis came shortly after our marriage, and it changed something in her. The possibility that I might fall ill, that our future together might be less certain. She began to detach herself, to build a life that could continue without me." He paused, searching for words. "I suppose I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew, you would stay out of pity, or worse, that you would leave too, preferring not to attach yourself to someone carrying this uncertainty." Emily approached him, gently placing her hand on his. "James," she said softly, "we all carry uncertainties. Life itself is uncertain. The fire reminded us of that. It's not the guarantee of a cloudless future that gives value to the present." She took his face in her hands, a gesture of intimacy she wouldn't have dared a few weeks earlier. "I didn't stay for the estate, nor for the money, nor for someone else's memories. I stayed because you taught me that real strength is allowing oneself to be vulnerable with someone." The use of the familiar "you" for the first time created a new closeness between them, as if the last veil of formality had just fallen. James's eyes lit up with an emotion that transcended gratitude or relief. It was the recognition of something precious and rare. "There's something else," he said, turning toward an ancient cabinet from which he extracted an inlaid wooden box. While workers were securing the structure after the fire, they discovered something in a collapsed wall, a secret compartment containing documents no one had seen for generations. He opened the box, revealing papers yellowed by time, property deeds, correspondence, sepia photographs. These documents reveal that this domain originally belonged to the Parker family, Your family, Emily. It was sold under duress during the Depression in unjust circumstances. Emily remained speechless, assimilating this unexpected revelation. Fragments of family stories told by her father suddenly took on new meaning. References to a lost New England estate, the melancholy that sometimes crossed her father's gaze when the region was mentioned. Legally and morally, part of this estate is rightfully yours, continued James. I've asked my lawyers to prepare documents for a partial transfer of property. No, Emily responded firmly, surprising James. I want nothing out of obligation or historical guilt. This estate is yours, James. What your family has made of it, how they've preserved and loved it for generations, that matters more than a legal document from 80 years ago. She took the papers and gently placed them back in the box. If we're to share something one day, let it be by mutual choice, not because of a debt from the past. James looked at her for a long time, a new admiration in his eyes. This refusal, this quiet but firm integrity, confirmed what he felt for her, a respect that went well beyond attraction or even affection. Then what would you say to sharing a future? He proposed, his voice barely louder than a whisper. Not immediately, not abandoning your professional dreams, but perhaps building something together, at your pace, on your terms. He approached, reducing the space between them until she could feel the warmth of his body, see the tiny wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, witnesses to a life fully lived despite its sorrows. I love you, Emily Parker, he said simply. Not as a replacement for what I've lost, but as an entirely new beginning. In the golden light of the pavilion, surrounded by books and drawings that told the story of a man who had momentarily lost his way, they sealed this declaration with their first kiss, sweet, hesitant, then increasingly confident, just as their relationship itself had evolved. When they finally separated, the sun had almost completely disappeared, giving way to a purple sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. The uncertainty that had inhabited Emily these past months had transformed into a quiet clarity. She now knew what she wanted, and it wasn't a choice between career and love, between New York and New England, but a life where these elements could coexist and mutually enrich each other. May covered New England with a carpet of wildflowers, scarlet trilliums, white daisies, and blue cornflowers forming an impressionist palette in the fields around the estate. The reconstruction works were advancing rapidly, and a bold plan was taking shape. The East Wing, once private and closed, would become a space open to the public, a cultural center dedicated to art and restoration. But May also meant separation. The internship at the Metropolitan Museum that Emily had negotiated would begin on the 1st of June, and while the distance between her and James was no longer emotional, it was about to become geographical for 6 months. 6 months, repeated James, helping her prepare her luggage, is nothing compared to the eternity we have ahead of us. Emily smiled, touched by this new confidence. The man who feared abandonment a few months earlier was now asserting with serenity that their love would survive this temporary separation. Will you come to New York? She asked, carefully folding a dress he had given her, a creation in lavender silk that recalled the New England fields. As often as the works allow me, he promised, and you'll return for weekends when you can. The train makes Boston, New York in less than 4 hours, a reasonable journey for love, don't you think? This lightness, this ability to joke about their impending separation, testified to the path they had traveled. The eve of her departure, they organized a small party in the garden newly planted with English roses that were just beginning to bud. William had prepared a New England feast, clam chowder fragrant with thyme, grilled sea bass with fennel, and of course lemon meringue pie, which had become Emily's favorite dessert. Under paper lanterns swaying gently in the evening breeze, James handed her a small package wrapped in tissue paper. So you can take a bit of New England with you to New York, he said, as she delicately unwrapped it. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with charcoal sketches, the estate seen from different angles, the gardens, the surrounding hills, and most touching of all, several portraits of her captured in the moment. Emily working on a painting, reading in the library, laughing in the garden. It's magnificent, she murmured, moved to tears by the delicacy of the gift. You've rediscovered your talent. Thanks to you, he replied simply. You've restored me, Emily, more completely than any work of art. The first morning in New York was strange, waking up in the small apartment the Metropolitan Museum had placed at her disposal, with the sound of traffic replacing the song of New England birds, the smell of coffee shops and bakeries rather than jasmine and pine. The city that had been her home during her student years now seemed foreign, as if her heart had definitively migrated to the countryside. The work at the Met was everything she had professionally hoped for: stimulating, prestigious, surrounded by the world's greatest masterpieces. Her colleagues, initially intimidating with their decades of experience, quickly recognized her exceptional talent and innovative approach to restoration. But it was the evenings that gave rhythm to her new life, those hours when, after work, she returned to her apartment and invariably found a letter from James. Against all expectations, this man from the previous generation had chosen the most traditional form of communication: handwritten letters, sometimes accompanied by sketches or small New England souvenirs, a dried maple leaf, a sprig of pine, a rose petal pressed between two sheets. Emily responded with the same constancy, her letters faintly smelling of the fixative she used for her own sketches of New York corners she was rediscovering with new eyes. Through these epistolary exchanges, they deepened their mutual knowledge in a way that physical proximity had not always allowed, the distance creating a space for reflection and expression that paradoxically enriched their relationship. "I realize, walking through these New York streets where I studied, how much I've changed," she wrote in one of her letters. "It's as if the New England light had altered my vision, allowing me to see nuances and depths I had never noticed before. Is this what love is? This capacity to transform our perception of the world?" James responded with equal honesty. "The estate is strangely alive despite your absence, as if your presence had awakened its walls, and now they refuse to fall back into their previous slumber. I'm working on the gallery plans with an energy I haven't felt since my architecture years. It's as if you've given me back not only my present, but also my past and my future." He came to New York twice in June, then 3 times in July, brief but intense visits where they explored the city together, James discovering New York through Emily's eyes, and she rediscovering her university city through James's curious and architectural gaze. In early August, as New York emptied for the summer holidays, Emily received a letter different from the others, thicker, containing several photographs. These were images of the East Wing under reconstruction, but transformed in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Here's what has been occupying me since your departure," explained James. "The East Wing won't simply be restored. It will become the New England Center for Art Restoration Training, a space where young talents without resources, like you were, can learn the craft under the guidance of masters. I've already secured funding commitments from several collectors, and the National Endowment for the Arts has expressed interest in a partnership." Emily contemplated the plans with wonder, recognizing in this transformation the most tangible proof of James's evolution, from guardian of a static past to creator of a living future. The financial sacrifice to transform part of his private property into public space was significant, but he had chosen purpose over fortune, something revolutionary for a man of his class. Their relationship, far from weakening with distance, seemed to strengthen, as if the physical separation allowed them to confirm that their connection transcended mere proximity. Sunday evening phone calls became a ritual as precious as the 5 o'clock coffee had been at the estate, an anchor in their week, a reminder that despite separation, their lives remained intertwined. One weekend in September, Emily returned to the estate to supervise the installation of a cutting-edge climate control system in the future training center. She was amazed by the transformation, not only of the buildings, but of James himself. He seemed younger, more energetic, as if the project had rejuvenated his spirit and body. And everywhere in the restored gardens, English roses, those mentioned in Elizabeth's letter, bloomed in abundance, their fragrance enveloping the domain like a promise kept. "You planted all these roses?" she asked, moved by this gesture that honored Elizabeth's wish while creating something new and beautiful. "Each day, I planted a new one," explained James. "And I took a photo to send you, so you could follow their growth even from afar." This weekend marked a subtle turning point in their relationship. Separation, far from being a trial to endure, had become a space for mutual growth, a confirmation that their love wasn't a reaction to loneliness or proximity, but a conscious and lasting choice. Returning to New York, Emily carried with her this new certainty, as well as a bouquet of fresh roses whose fragrance permeated her small New York apartment, creating an olfactory bridge between the two worlds she now inhabited, the intellectual sophistication of New York and the sensual beauty of the New England countryside. October painted New England in amber and copper tints. The vineyards around the estate turned red and gold, and the first morning mists wrapped the hills in an ethereal veil that slowly dissipated under the still warm sun of the southern autumn. At the Richardson estate, preparations were in full swing for the inauguration of the Art Restoration Training Center, planned for November. Emily had obtained 2 weeks' leave from the Met to supervise the final details of the educational workshop installation. After 4 months of separation interspersed with brief visits, she returned to the estate with a mixture of excitement and serenity. This place was no longer simply a work setting or even James's domain. It had become, in a way she could never have imagined a year earlier, her home. James was waiting on the portico when the taxi dropped her off in front of the wrought iron gates. Unlike her first arrival, no nervousness inhabited her as she walked up the gravel path. There was in her stride a quiet confidence, that of a woman returning home after an absence. "Welcome home," said James, embracing her, his grey eyes reflecting a deep joy that had replaced the melancholy of former times. The estate itself seemed different, brighter, more alive. Craftsmen came and went in the East Wing, adding the finishing touches to the transformation. William, faithful to his post, but now assisted by a younger team to manage the expansion of the domain's activities, welcomed them with a discreet but warm smile. "Miss Emily," he said with evident affection, "your blue room awaits you. I've taken the liberty of placing fresh roses there." "Thank you, William," she replied with a complicit smile. "But I think we can abandon formalities now, don't you think?" The old man nodded, his eyes twinkling with silent approval for this relationship that had transformed his master and the estate he had served for so long. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity: meetings with future instructors at the center, installation of cutting-edge equipment for the workshops, finalizing the selection of the first scholarship students who would come from all over the country to learn the delicate art of restoration. Emily immersed herself in these preparations with passion, aware that this project embodied a perfect fusion of her professional skills and personal vision. One evening, as the sun set over the golden vineyards, James took her to a part of the domain she had never explored, a small hidden valley behind the Hill of Oaks, where a stream peacefully meandered. An ancient watermill stood there, its stones patinated by centuries, its wheel motionless but intact. "I thought this place might interest you," said James, observing her reaction with particular attention. "The mill dates from the 17th century, but it hasn't been used for generations." Emily explored the building, admiring the massive oak beams and ancient mechanisms preserved by the dry New England climate. Through the small paned windows, the view of the valley was spectacular, a panorama of vineyards, maples and pines extending to the foothills of the Berkshires. "It's a magical place," she murmured, already imagining how the space could be transformed while preserving its historical character. "It could be ours," said James, his voice calm but charged with intention. "Not like the estate, which will always partly belong to history and the Richardson family, but this place could be our common creation." Emily turned toward him, understanding the underlying proposal. "You're suggesting we restore it together? As our home?" James approached, taking her hands in his. "I'm suggesting we create here a space that is neither the past nor the present, but our future. A place that honors history, but is entirely our own." The emotion that traversed Emily was complex, recognition of the beauty of the gesture, but also appreciation of the wisdom that underpinned it. James instinctively understood her need for independence, to create something that fully belonged to her, rather than simply inviting her to inhabit his pre-existing world. "I would like that very much," she replied, squeezing his hands with emotion. "A project that would truly be ours." They spent the following days sketching plans for the mill, their complementary training, she in art restoration, he in architecture, creating a creative synergy that further strengthened their connection. They imagined how the space could be transformed into a home that would respect the building's history while adapting it to their modern needs, a workshop for her, an architecture studio for him, common spaces bathed in New England light. The day before her scheduled return to New York, an unexpected visitor arrived at the estate. Charlotte, James's sister. Emily, working in the library, heard her distinctive voice in the hall and prepared for a confrontation. Their last meeting had been tense, and despite all the changes that had occurred since then, she feared Charlotte's attitude toward her hadn't evolved. But when Charlotte entered the library, her expression wasn't one of condescension or hostility, but of an almost respectful curiosity. "Miss Parker," she said, advancing with innate elegance, "my brother has informed me of your joint projects for the training center. It's remarkable." Emily rose, greeting Charlotte with cautious courtesy. "Thank you. It's a project close to both our hearts." Charlotte surveyed the room, noting the subtle but significant changes, the restored paintings now proudly displayed, the center's plans laid out on the large table, the discreet feminine touches that had humanized this once austere space. "I owe you an apology," she finally said, surprising Emily with her frankness. "I was protective toward my brother in a way that was neither necessary nor fair to you." She sat gracefully in an armchair near the fireplace, gesturing for Emily to do the same. "I feared he would remain a prisoner of the past," continued Charlotte, an unusual vulnerability in her voice, "and paradoxically it was my hostility that risked keeping him there." This unexpected confession created a new space of understanding between the two women. Charlotte then revealed something that shocked Emily. Before leaving, Elizabeth had confided to her that she wished James would find someone who would truly love him, since she had never managed to love him as he deserved. "She knew she was hurting him by leaving," explained Charlotte, "but she thought it was more cruel to stay in a marriage where she couldn't offer what he needed." This revelation gave Emily a deeper understanding of the history that had preceded her arrival at the estate. Not a simple betrayal, but a complex situation where two people had loved each other, but not in the way the other needed to be loved. "James has changed since your arrival," admitted Charlotte. "He's become again the man he was before, passionate, creative, oriented toward the future, rather than a prisoner of the past. And for that, I am grateful to you." This improbable ally then offered her help in navigating the social complexities that their relationship would face in conservative New England society. A sincere proposal that testified to her acceptance of Emily not as an intruder, but as an integral part of her brother's future life. This unexpected reconciliation brought Emily a feeling of fullness, as if the last piece of a complex puzzle had just found its place. The circle of relationships that defined her life at the estate was now complete. Each tension resolved, each resistance transformed into acceptance. The evening before her departure for New York, James organized an intimate dinner in the Rose Garden, now magnificent in its autumn splendor. Under the New England stars, and surrounded by the fragrance of the season's last roses, they shared their hopes for the coming months, the center's inauguration, the mill's work, and their future life together. "2 months," said James, raising his glass of local wine in a toast. "2 months and your internship at the Met will be over." "2 months," repeated Emily, clinking her glass against his. "And our true life together can begin." In this simple promise resided a quiet certainty. The distance that would still separate them during these last weeks was no longer an obstacle to overcome, but simply a prelude to an already certain reunion. November in New York offered a striking contrast to the autumn softness of the New England countryside. Low gray sky, persistent drizzle, and that damp cold that seems to penetrate to the bone despite layers of clothing. However, Emily found a melancholy beauty in this New York season. The golden leaves of the plane trees in Central Park, the reflections of street lamps in puddles, the welcoming warmth of the cafes where she sometimes stopped after her days at the Met. Her internship was coming to a close, and a formal offer of permanent employment had arrived on her desk, a prestigious position that would have represented the fulfillment of her former professional ambitions. But the Emily who contemplated this offer was no longer quite the same as the one who had passed through the gates of the Richardson estate almost a year earlier. Her colleagues at the Met had noticed the change in her, a quiet confidence, a serenity that perfectly complemented her technical talent. The director of the restoration department himself had taken her aside one afternoon. "Your work is exceptional, Miss Parker, but what is even more remarkable is your perspective. You seem to understand that we don't simply restore objects, but testimonies of lives lived. That's rare and precious. This compliment had touched her deeply, as it precisely reflected the transformation she had experienced. This understanding that art, like life itself, wasn't something to be preserved under glass, but a living expression in constant evolution. 2 weeks from the end of her internship, while working on a delicate Turner watercolor, an unexpected phone call disrupted her day. It was William, his usually impassive voice betraying an unusual concern. "Miss Emily," he said, reflexively returning to formality in his agitation, "Mr. James has been admitted to the Boston General Hospital this morning. His heart condition, a minor complication, the doctors are sure," but Emily didn't listen further. In less than an hour, she had obtained an emergency leave, packed her bag, and was in a taxi to Penn Station, her heart pounding with a fear she had never felt before, the visceral fear of losing someone who had become the center of her universe. The train journey seemed interminable, each minute stretching her nerves like violin strings pulled too tight. She tried to reassure herself. James had explained his condition to her, had insisted that with appropriate monitoring it didn't significantly affect life expectancy. But fear doesn't listen to reason, and the 3-hour journey was among the longest of her life. At South Station she found Charlotte waiting for her, her usual elegance slightly crumpled by worry. "How is he?" Emily asked without preamble as she got into the car. "Stable," replied Charlotte, driving toward the hospital. "The doctors are talking about an arrhythmia, nothing catastrophic but serious enough to warrant hospitalization. They want to adjust his treatment." In the car, Charlotte explained that James had felt palpitations and dizziness that very morning, while supervising the final preparations for the center's inauguration. He had minimized the symptoms, but William, vigilant and perceptive as always, had insisted on calling an ambulance. At the hospital, they found James in a private room, his complexion paler than usual but his eyes lighting up at the sight of Emily. "You shouldn't have come," he said, a smile immediately contradicting his words. "It's just a small treatment adjustment." Emily approached the bed, taking his hand with a tenderness mixed with firmness. "If you think I'd stay quietly in New York while you're here, you know me very little, James Richardson." This observation drew a laugh from the patient, followed by a slight grimace when the heart monitor beside the bed emitted an irregular beep. "Easy with the humor," interjected a doctor entering the room. "Mr. Richardson needs calm for the next 48 hours. Doctor Mitchell, a renowned cardiologist in the region, explained the situation to them with reassuring clarity. James's condition wasn't aggravated, but recent stress related to the center project and certain medication errors had provoked this episode. With a treatment adjustment and a few days of rest, he could return home. "The inauguration," began James, but the doctor raised an authoritative hand. "The inauguration can wait a week or two. Your heart, however, deserves your immediate attention." When the doctor left the room, Charlotte excused herself to go find coffee, leaving Emily and James alone. A silence laden with emotions settled between them. "I was afraid," Emily finally admitted, her fingers intertwined with James's. "So afraid that I understood something essential." "What?" he asked softly. "That I don't want this separation anymore, even temporary. That my place is where you are, whether in New York, New England, or elsewhere." She pulled from her bag an envelope, the Met's offer, and placed it on the bedside table. "I received this last week, a permanent position in the restoration department. Once, it was my ultimate dream." James watched her attentively, his expression indecipherable. "And now, I know it's just a workplace, not a life. I spoke with the director this morning while waiting for my train. They're willing to transform the position into regular consultation, 3 days a month in New York. The rest of the time I could teach at the center, work on independent projects, and live with me at the mill," completed James, a smile illuminating his face despite his fatigue. "If that's still what you want." Emily leaned over, gently kissing his forehead. "That's exactly what I want, and I won't let your unpredictable heart decide when we begin this life together. As soon as you leave here, I'm staying. For good." This declaration, pronounced in the simplicity of a hospital room, rather than the romantic setting of the estate or the rose garden, carried a conviction that transcended circumstances. It was a choice made not in the emotion of a perfect moment, but in the imperfect and sometimes frightening reality of real life, a commitment all the more powerful. The following days created a new dynamic between them. Emily temporarily installed herself at the estate, coordinating the finalization of her work at the Met remotely, while managing preparations for the postponed inauguration of the center. She watched over James with an attention that was neither stifling nor worried, but simply present and attentive, respecting his independence while ensuring his well-being. A week after his hospitalization, James was sufficiently recovered to return to the estate, with strict instructions for rest. The forced convalescence, far from frustrating him as Emily had feared, seemed to offer him a new perspective, a reminder that life, like the art they both cherished, was precious precisely because it was fragile. One afternoon, as they sat on the sunny terrace, enjoying a respite in November's freshness, James handed her a small box of midnight blue velvet. "It's not what you think," he said with a smile, seeing her surprised expression. "Or at least not exactly." Inside was not a ring, but an ancient wrought-iron key attached to a lavender silk ribbon. "The key to the mill," he explained. "The work can begin next week if you wish. Our project, our place, our future." Emily took the key, moved by this symbol more significant to her than a diamond would have been. It was the promise not of possession, but of partnership, not of a traditional role, but of a common creation. "I accept it," she said simply, sliding the key into her dress pocket, with all it represents. They sealed this exchange with a kiss that contained all the history of their meeting, the initial caution, the progressive discovery, and now the absolute trust. Behind them the estate stood, a silent witness to this transformation, no longer a mausoleum of abandoned memories, but the cradle of a future neither could have imagined a year earlier. The inauguration of the New England Center for Art Restoration Training finally took place in early December, attracting regional and national press, dignitaries from the cultural world, and above all, the first scholarship students, 10 young talents from modest backgrounds selected for their exceptional potential. Emily, standing beside James as he symbolically cut the ribbon, felt a pride that surpassed anything she had experienced in her career until then. It wasn't simply a professional accomplishment, but the tangible incarnation of a shared vision, a transformation that had touched not only their personal lives, but would now radiate to others. When James took the floor to officially inaugurate the center, his words resonated with an emotion that touched all present. This place was born from a restoration, not just of walls and objects, but of possibilities and hopes. It represents our conviction that preserving the past makes sense only if we also build the future. His gaze met Emily's, and in this moment of silent connection, both knew that these words applied as much to their personal history as to the project taking life around them. Spring had returned to New England even more resplendent than the previous year. The cherry trees in bloom formed pink and white clouds on the hills, and in the valley, the small stream that once fed the mill sang, swollen by April's rains. The New England sky, of an almost unreal blue, reflected in the new windows of the restored mill, now transformed into a dwelling that perfectly embodied the harmony between history and modernity. Emily and James had moved in a month earlier, once the essential work was completed. The golden stone building preserved its rustic charm on the exterior, but the interior had been entirely reimagined. Open spaces bathed in light, ancient beams preserved but complemented by contemporary materials, a workshop for Emily under the north skylight, and for James an architecture studio in the old millstone room, its large arched windows offering a spectacular view of the vineyards and maples. This May morning, Emily stood on the terrace, a cup of coffee in hand, contemplating the garden they had created together, a carefully organized mix that nonetheless seemed natural, where English roses, lavender, and aromatic herbs coexisted in a symphony of colors and fragrances. She wore a simple pale blue linen dress, her hair now longer gathered in a loose chignon, a few strands escaping to dance in the light breeze. A year had passed since her arrival at the Richardson estate, a year that had transformed every aspect of her life in a way she could never have anticipated. At 24 now, she had found a balance that once seemed impossible to her, between professional passion and personal fulfillment, between independence and deep connection, between her New York roots and her new life in the New England countryside. The Art Restoration Training Center was prospering beyond their hopes. The first class of students was flourishing under the guidance of Emily, and other instructors recruited from across Europe. 2 days a week, she taught at the center, sharing her expertise and passion with young talents who reminded her of her own journey. 3 days a month, she went to New York for her consultations at the Met, bringing to the prestigious museum a perspective enriched by her New England experience. And the rest of the time, she worked on independent projects in her mill workshop, restoring works carefully selected for their artistic significance rather than their commercial value. James had surprised her with his capacity to adapt to this new life. Far from regretting the pomp or prestige of his previous existence, he seemed to flourish in this relative simplicity, rediscovering his passion for architecture while managing the family domain with a renewed vision. The Richardson estate remained their reception venue and the heart of the center's activities, but the mill had become their true home, a private space where they could simply be themselves, freed from expectations and traditions. Footsteps on the garden gravel pulled Emily from her reverie. James was approaching, holding a freshly picked bouquet of English roses, the very ones Elizabeth had mentioned in her letter and that they had planted together. "To celebrate the anniversary," he said, handing her the fragrant flowers. "1 year to the day since your arrival at the estate gates, trembling and determined." Emily accepted the bouquet, burying her face in the delicate petals to breathe in their perfume. Who would have thought that this intimidated young restorer would end up restoring much more than paintings? James smiled, that smile that always transformed his face, erasing the years of solitude and grief. At 43, he wore his hair slightly longer than before, and smile lines had replaced the furrows of worry around his eyes. "I have a surprise for you," he announced, taking her hand to guide her toward a part of the garden surrounded by a boxwood hedge that concealed it from view from the terrace. Behind this hedge was a new space he had created in secret during her trips to New York, a small enclosed garden in the Mediterranean tradition, with an ancient stone fountain at its center. On a wall sheltered from the north wind, a fresco had been painted, a reproduction of the first painting she had restored at the estate, that Monet representing a garden bathed in light. "It's magnificent," she murmured, moved by the attention to detail. The plants were exactly those represented in the original painting, creating a dialogue between art and life that perfectly summarized their story. At the center of this garden, a table had been set for an intimate breakfast, fresh pastries, seasonal fruits, and 2 flutes of local rosé sparkling wine glinting in the morning light. "Isn't it a bit early for sparkling wine?" joked Emily, while sitting in the chair he held for her. "Not when we have something important to celebrate," replied James, taking his place across from her. He pulled from his pocket a small object wrapped in antique silk. Unfolding it carefully, he revealed a ring, not a traditional diamond, but an amethyst stone surrounded by tiny pearls, mounted on an aged gold band that evoked Art Nouveau. "It belonged to my grandmother," he explained. "The one who corresponded with your grandmother, Margaret. She gave it to me before her death, telling me to offer it only to a woman who would understand that true beauty comes from the history objects carry, not their market value." He paused, searching for the right words. "I'm not offering it as a traditional proposal, Emily. Our relationship has always transcended conventions. I offer it as a symbol of the cycle completing itself, our grandparents separated by history, and us reunited by it." Emily took the ring, studying it with the expert eye of the restorer she was. The stone captured light in an almost magical way, revealing depths of purple and blue that recalled the New England sky at twilight. "It's perfect," she said simply, sliding it onto her finger where it fitted as if created for her. "Like everything that has led us here." They raised their flutes in a silent toast, words becoming superfluous between them. Their story, like the works of art they cherished, needed no verbal explanations to be deeply felt and understood. Later that day, they organized a small reception at the mill, their first event in their new home. William was present, of course, as well as Charlotte and her husband. The center's students had been invited, bringing with them the vitality and enthusiasm of youth. Even Emily's father had made the journey from Boston, his gaze filled with pride and wonder at the life his daughter had built. Under the string lights suspended between the garden trees, with the setting sun gilding the ancient stones of the mill, Emily observed this improbable assembly: Manhattan aristocrats and local artisans, emeritus professors and novice students, all gathered in a harmony that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. James joined her, slipping his arm around her waist with an ease born of habit and affection. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, following her gaze to their guests who were conversing joyfully. "I'm thinking that restoration isn't just a matter of preserving what has been," she replied, her fingers playing with the amethyst on her finger. "It's also knowing when to allow something new to be born, when to let light in through the cracks." James smiled, recognizing in her words the echo of their common journey, two souls broken in different ways, who had found, in their respective fragments, the possibility of a mosaic more beautiful and stronger than the original works. "Do you know what Elizabeth wrote to me in her last letter?" he asked softly. "She said that sometimes truly loving someone means freeing them to find their own path, even if that path moves away from ours. I didn't understand then, but now you understand that she offered you the freedom to find me," completed Emily, "just as I had to free myself from my expectations to find you." They watched together as the sun disappeared behind the hills, transforming the sky into an impressionist canvas of pinks, oranges, and purples. The same sky their grandparents had contemplated decades earlier, the same that had inspired the painters whose heritage they preserved, and the same that would continue to watch over future generations, long after they would no longer be there to admire it. In the distance, the lights of the Richardson estate turned on one by one, like earthly stars guiding travelers to a haven of peace and beauty. But this evening, Emily and James didn't need this beacon. They had found their port, their anchorage in each other. "You were right that first evening," murmured Emily, turning toward James, their silhouettes etched against the fiery sky. "When you said, 'You're mine now,' but it wasn't possession," he replied, completing their common story. "It was recognition. Two souls that have finally found their home in each other. Around them, the roses perfumed the evening air, silent witnesses to a restoration that far surpassed the mere preservation of the past, the creation of a vibrant present and a future full of promises. Between the white walls of a New England mill where two different stories had finally converged to form just one, richer and more beautiful than each would have been separately.